Okay, so welcome to a new series. The next big project I'm working on is gonna take some time, so I was just thinking that I could try something a little bit more freeform and a little less scripted to hold people over until then. I want this series to be about me sharing my own personal fighting game mentalities that I've gained throughout the years, and condense it in a way that makes it easier for myself and the students I teach to understand. Because this is about the personal mentalities that I've gained throughout the FGC, it's gonna be a little bit more subjective. But I hope the way that I've broken down fighting game terminology helps someone else pick up games faster in the future. So, this first episode is gonna be all about fighting game character archetypes. I believe that all fighting game characters, and to a lesser extent all competitive game characters as a whole, can be classified in a spectrum of 3 different groups. Those categories are the rushdown archetype, the boxer archetype, and the zoner archetype. These archetypes are often defined by the range of the character's win condition. As you'd probably imagine, rushdown want to be as close to their opponent as possible. Rushdowns will often have moves that allow them to get closer to their opponents, or just in general have strengths that are tied behind them being close range. That can be fast close range buttons, high damage output, etc, etc. Boxers, as the name implies, typically have very strong hitboxes that oftentimes outrange other characters' close range hitboxes. They win the game by putting themselves at a mid-range where they can hit their opponents with their attacks, but their opponent can't hit them. I've already drawn it out here, but sometimes it can be obvious, like a character having a sword, or any other disjoint really, but that doesn't always have to be the case. They can simply have larger hitboxes than most other characters, or properties on their moves that help them win those mid-range scuffles. Think stuff like Marissa's Gladius. It's a very large hitbox that also comes with armor, so it's really good at beating out people at mid-range. And lastly, as you probably would guess, zoners almost always have a consistent way to tack on pressure from a distance. This puts pressure on the opponent to make a decision and try to approach them in a way that the zoner can capitalize on. Typically, if the zoner themselves decides to approach, it's either because they're getting out-zoned and they're forced to, or they're approaching on their own terms in a manner that allows them to reset back to full screen safety. Now, I mentioned it before, but these are not definitive boxes. Most of the time, these are more of a spectrum. Characters very rarely only land in one of these boxes. Instead, they're usually somewhere on this line. For example, a character like Donkey Kong is really good close range. This is because of his really oppressive grab game. He gets a lot off a very simple punish, but he often lacks methods of getting in like a pure rushdown would. Instead, he often relies on large disjointed hitboxes to bait his opponent into making a mistake that he can capitalize on. He'll do things like F-tilt an opponent over and over again until they're conditioned to shield, and then he runs in for the grab. He uses the combination of being a threatening rushdown and an oppressive boxer to control tempo and create openings. A little bit further down the chart is a zoner boxer, and there is a very notorious one in Guile. Guile has several methods of walling out his opponents, from low lag projectiles to very large hitboxes with special properties. But typically, he loses the Fireball War due to his charge requirement on a Sonic Boom. However, if his projectile clashes close enough, it allows him to counterattack first. This is often referred to as the Shoto Killer. So, because of the limitations on his charge mechanic, he wants to stay far enough away to safely bait and react to his opponent's options, but not so far away that he's at risk of being the one who's forced to approach. And while I didn't really outline it very well on this chart, there actually is a combination of rushdown and zoner. It all ends up wrapping back around. A good example of a character like this would be Venom from the Guilty Gear series. Typically, he wants a lot of space so he can set up his pressure, but he also doesn't get much pressure from full screen either. He often has to run in with his projectiles to get stuff done. He utilizes a strong overhead low mix-up game that are often covered by projectile traps on knockdown that can safely put him at a favorable range if incorrect, or reward him with another knockdown to set up against if he's correct. But you may be asking, why are any of these labels important in the first place? Well, in the massive fighting game community, being able to boil almost every character in every fighting game down to these 3 categories is helpful not just for figuring out how to play them, but also how to play against them no matter what fighting game you pick up. It's very likely that a character you might like in a different fighting game falls under the same archetype. Obviously, that's not always the case. People can pick mains for a variety of reasons. But obviously, if playing a zoner is what clicks with you, it's very likely that playing a zoner in a different fighting game will also click with you. Most of the time when you are picking up a new fighting game, you've already done the mental groundwork of an archetype that you're familiar with in a different one. Let's take myself as an example. I, myself, enjoy the power fantasy that comes with the rushdown archetype of just running in and just beating someone down relentlessly. But I also don't like the do or die limitation of always needing to be close range in order to be effective. I enjoy being able to play a little bit more defensively with big hitboxes should the situation call for it. So, as you'd imagine, I fall most cleanly in the rushdown boxer archetype of characters. And if you look at the characters that I choose to main in fighting games, you would see that this is primarily the case. Characters like Donkey Kong in the Smash series, Marissa in Street Fighter 6, Jason in Multiverses, Soul Bad Guy in Guilty Gear, Darius in 2XKO, Big Band in Skullgirls, etc, etc, you get the point. One last thing that I should note whenever it comes to these archetypes is that it is still all subjective, and you can play a character who's designed as a rushdown as a zoner if you really wanted to. You can just say, screw all of this noise, I'm playing rushdown Guile. It's the most American way to play Guile. But oftentimes, if you choose to play characters in an archetype that they're not really designed for, you're actively choosing to not play around their design strengths, and that can be a bit of a handicap. To wrap things up, we're going to run through the 3 games that I'm the most familiar with and start categorizing some of the characters just as a little exercise. We'll start off with Smash Ultimate. Now, I already mentioned before that Donkey Kong is a rushdown boxer. Donkey Kong's got a really oppressive close range grab game, and he's also got some of the largest hitboxes in the entire game. Completely disjointed too. When it comes to being a little bit more of a dedicated rushdown though, I would put Captain Falcon there. Now, Captain Falcon does have some hitboxes that can outbox certain characters at close range, but as most of you watching this video probably already know, Captain Falcon is almost always at his best when he's running you down and overwhelming you. And this is what I'm talking about when I say that no character is cleanly in one camp definitively. It's all on a spectrum. But if we want to talk about characters that fit pretty cleanly into a specific category, I would definitely say Marth and Lucina are pretty definitively boxers. Their game plan is exactly what you'd expect from a boxer, just constantly wanting to keep you at the tip of their sword's length and being constantly able to put on pressure that you can't really contest. While there are a lot of characters in this game that you could probably classify as a boxer zoner, the one that most of you will probably be familiar with, even if it's just from a casual sense, is Link. One thing that I didn't really get to mention previously is that characters like Link, or other characters that fall somewhere in the middle on the spectrum, aren't just inherently better or have more options than characters who are more definitively inside one of the boxes. While Link's sword definitely beats people at mid-range, as you would probably expect, because of his extra options as a zoner, they tend to be a lot slower and a lot less safe than someone who is a dedicated boxer. But while he does tend to fall a little bit short in the boxer category, he does make up for this with the extra options of being able to play sort of like a zoner. Options like arrow, boomerang, bomb, all of these can keep people on their toes and force people to approach. An issue that boxers can have if they don't have more range than their opponent. But once again, at the same time, Link's zoning options are going to be a little bit weaker than someone who is more of a dedicated zoner. Dedicated zoners like Samus, for example. Samus has a laundry list of attacks that not only put on pressure from a distance, but also make it really difficult to get on top of her. And her close range game, because of that, is inherently lackluster. It's pretty infamous in the Smash scene, and it even has an in-game tip telling you about it, but her jab 1 is not true into her jab 2. So, as you can probably tell, Samus is a pretty dedicated zoner. And while we don't have a ton of trap characters that I would call a zoner rushdown, there is, in fact, a couple characters that I would call zoner rushdown. The one you might see most prominently is Lucas. Lucas's close range frame data is insane once he gets on top of you. And he's also got some pretty oppressive long range projectiles to keep the pressure on. But where Lucas's weaknesses really lie is how stubby his attacks are. He's got great options for when he's on top of you and when he's far away from you, but it's not uncommon for Lucas to be boxed out really hard at mid-range. Now, we're not going to list every Smash character in these categories. That would be an entire video all on its own. If you guys are interested in that though, I will make that video, so just let me know in the comments below. But feel free to make your own list for your own visual reference about how to play as or against these characters. It's important to know where your character's strengths lie as well as your opponent. By playing around these strengths and playing around your opponent's weaknesses, that's how you win games. I want to make it clear that you can do this in every game though, not just Smash. So let's go ahead and talk about where some of the characters lie in Street Fighter 6. The obvious characters that come to mind when you think Rushdown is probably Cammy. But obviously characters like Jamie, Kimberly, and probably a few others could also fit in this category. Not only are these characters at their best when they are on top of the opponent, but they also have a plethora of tools to help them get on top of their opponent. And that really helps define them as a Rushdown character. As far as Rushdown boxers go, you could put a ton of characters in this category. And what I put in this category is probably going to be different from the next person you ask. When I think Rushdown boxers, I think characters like Marissa, M. Bison to an extent, Zangief, of course, Lily, also a good example, Manon, also a good example, DJ to some extent, Ken, probably, Honda for sure, oh, and Akuma. Oh, and while I was thinking about it, I think Rashid is also a Rushdown character. This is probably what it'd look like so far, but as you can probably notice, a lot of these characters do want to be on top of you. They do want to be in a similar zone as a Rushdown would, but instead of relying on options that would get them in, they kind of have to control the tempo of the match in order to provide opportunities for them to get in. There are obviously some characters that fall a little bit more Rushdown than boxer here, like, you know, DJ's Drive Rush could be a really good example of a move that just gets you in the same way a dive kick would on a Rushdown. And you can make that same argument with M. Bison. But for the most part, these characters aren't just rushing you down. They're kind of going about it in a more slow and methodical method. Speaking of slow and methodical though, there are obviously a bunch of characters that fall under the boxer archetype as well. But I will say a lot of the boxers also usually do have some projectile element to them. So, you know, they can fall a little bit more down the zoner pipeline. But obviously characters like Chun-Li, characters like Ed, they're really reliant on outboxing people with their huge hitboxes. And while they do have projectiles, they're not necessarily walling you out with them. They're more like means to an end. And that end being putting you at a range where they can just be really oppressive with their hitboxes. I guess to some extent, you could maybe say Terry belongs here instead of Boxer Zoner, but you know, it's debatable. Like I said though, a lot of the people who rely on more solid boxing tools also have a fireball that they can choose to zone you out with. We already talked about Guile, but Ryu and Luke also fall under this category. Realistically, you could probably move Chun-Li down or Terry down if you wanted to, but you know, it's not a huge deal. Like I said, it's all subjective at the end of the day. It just kind of helps people condense all of this information. As long as you're not putting Guile in Rushdown or Ryu in Rushdown, I think you'll be fine. When you think dedicated zoner though, you're probably thinking JP. Or Dalsum, if you're an old head. These characters pretty much always want to be full screen. And while yes, they do have some good mid-screen buttons, making it arguable for them to be put into the boxer zoner category, they also almost always want to be at full screen and not mid-range. Usually mid-range is a pretty dangerous region for these characters, as one fuck-up can lead to them dying. They're not getting touch of death or anything like that, but they can be put into a losing situation. Dhalsim though might be getting touch of death since he doesn't really have a reversal. And lastly, for Zoner Rushdown, I could probably say Blanca and Aki, definitively. Definitively Blanca and Aki. And once again, these are characters that have pretty good mid-range buttons, but most of the time either want to be completely on top of you, just hitting you with some crazy mix, or they want to be full screen looking for their opportunity or putting on pressure of some kind. If you watch Menard or really any high-level Blanca play though, you will see them use some boxing tools at some point, but at the end of the day, he's at his best when he's at max range or in your face. Now, lastly, Jury is a weird one, because you could probably make an argument for her to be in almost any of these categories except pure Zoner. But I'm going to put her in Zoner Rushdown. And don't get me wrong, her crouching medium kick, it's a war crime. That move by itself is probably better than any boxing tool that Terry has realistically. But, and hear me out, Jury's design mechanic in her stacks can only be done safely if she's at max range or if she's doing it in a combo. Not to mention, when she has install ready, she's a beast at rushing you down. So this is roughly what I'd say Street Fighter 6's chart looks like. Obviously, like I said, it's all subjective, so your list could be completely different from mine. But the primary takeaway from this is that a lot of the characters in these similar categories you can fight pretty much the same. Obviously, there's a lot of matchup specific things, don't get me wrong. If you answer Cammy's dive kick the same way you'd answer Jamie's dive kick, you're probably gonna lose. But as far as general game plan and where they want to space themselves on screen, you can get a general idea from this chart. Alright, I'm gonna really quickly run through multiverses just because I know I have a large audience that plays multiverses. And they're probably curious about where I'd put each character from the game. Alright, so let's really quickly get through this. As far as rushdown characters that come to mind immediately, I'd definitely say characters like Arya, characters like Batman, Harley Quinn of course, Superman's a big one. Taz and Powerpuff Girls basically have no option except to rush you down. Beetlejuice is also up there. Finn, of course, I don't know how I was forgetting him. And I wanna say Stripe, but he could be a zoner rushdown. But I think that's every character I'd classify as a pure rushdown. Rushdown boxers are characters like Marceline, Jason, Wonder Woman of course. Banana Guard is a big one. I'd probably also put Joker up there. Even though he does have zoning options, they're not available at all times, so he just kind of uses them to beat out hitboxes. Agent Smith, another character who's really good close range, but also at boxing you out. Garnet, of course. And while you could argue that it's probably Rushdown Zoner, I'm gonna say Black Adam. Just because a lot of the time he's not zoning you out, he's just kind of using his projectiles as an extra way to beat out your hitboxes. I think that's everyone for Rushdown Boxer as well, so let's move on to Boxer. Jake is the first one that comes to mind. Samurai Jack, of course, very similar to Marth and Lucina in that aspect. Nubia, very good example. And I think that's about it for the pure boxers. Honestly, we do not have a ton of pure boxer characters. Oh, wait, Iron Giant I would say is a pure boxer character as well. His entire game plan is based around just having huge hitboxes. And hurt boxes, but that's another story. Boxer Zoner can apply to a few characters. Marvin's a pretty big one just with his down tilt and down air. Morty, of course, is really big with his Sair as well as his grenades. Bugs Bunny, he's a big one. He's a really big one. And I think that wraps it up for our boxer zoners. Moving on to pure zoners, Rain Dog is pretty much the poster child of that. But we also have Velma, Rick, Gizmo probably also falls in this archetype. Tom and Jerry, of course. But I think that finishes up zoners. And then for Zoner Rushdown, believe it or not, a lot of people would probably expect me to put Shaggy in Rushdown, but he actually is at his best when he's able to pull sandwiches and get his Super Saiyan charge. So I think that handily lands him in Zoner Rushdown. Same thing with Steven. Steven's a character who has a really oppressive combo game, but he also wants to kind of sit back and wait for his cooldowns. LeBron is all too often running you down, but also keeping you super oppressed with his projectiles. And lastly, Raven. I don't know where she'd go. I want to put her in Zoner Rushdown because, you know, she is kind of a trap puppet character. Not really a puppet character, just she can do attacks off of an object she puts down. But at the same time, she is, you know, pretty stubby, all things considered, aside from her nair. And she has a really good combo game when she gets going. So, you know what? I think Zoner Rushdown actually does work pretty well for Raven. So, yeah, this is what I got for the Multiverses version of the chart. I hope that my perspective on character archetypes has helped you in some way. If it has, or if you have a completely different mentality about character archetypes, be sure to tell me about it in the comments below. And per usual, while you're down there, be sure to go ahead and subscribe if you haven't, and drop a like if you liked the video. But yeah, that's all I got. I'll see you guys in the next video.